All right, I'm only going to hear you through. All right. Assalamualaikum.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You're going to have to turn down.
So you'll have to mute yourself when you go. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. Just gonna ping a few people and then we can get started, inshallah.
And I'm sending you the link over WhatsApp.
Okay.
And I'll post the book club as well.
Do you want to give it a couple minutes or should we get started?
We can start. You want to make me a moderator?
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. Sorry about that.
No?
I thought it automatically made you a mod if you're like a Muslim book club admin.
No, it's fine. I'll start pinging people in and we can start.
Okay. Okay, so I'll start. So welcome to everybody in the audience. This is the second day that we'll be reading Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul by William Chittick. The book is essentially about Islamic cosmology in the modern world, and today we'll be reading between pages 16 and 31. So this section is called The Goal of the Intellectual Understanding. Understanding the nature of false gods has always been central to the intellectual sciences, but it cannot be the concern of the transmitted sciences. One cannot accept Tawheed simply on the basis of imitation, which is to say that it stands outside the domain of transmitted learning. Tawheed must be understood if people are to have faith in it, even if their understanding is far from perfect. Much of the intellectual tradition has been concerned with explaining Tawheed and the manner in which it clarifies the objects of faith: God, angels, scriptures, prophets, the last day, and the measuring out the good of it and the evil of it. How are Muslims to understand these objects? Why should they have faith in them? True faith can never be blind belief, but rather commitment to what one actually knows to be true. In discussing God and the other objects of faith in the light of Tawheed, it is important to explain not only what they are, but also what they are not. When people do not know what God is, it is easy for them to fall into the habit of worshiping false gods. And that leaves them with no protection against the taqdeer of the modern world, the multiplicity of gods that modern ways of thinking demand that they serve. What is striking about contemporary Islam's encounter with modernity is that Muslims lack the intellectual preparation to deal with the situation. Muslim thinkers, with a few honorable exceptions, do not question the legitimacy of the modern gods. Rather, they debate over the best way to serve them. In other words, they think that Islamic society must be modified and adapted to achieve the ideals represented by the gods of modernity, and especially those designated by the plastic words. That is to say that innumerable modern-day Muslims are forever looking for the best ways to bring their society into conformity with the rejection of Tawheed. Many Muslims today recognize that the West has paid too high a price for modernization and secularization. They see that various social crises have arisen in all modernized societies, and they understand that these crises are somehow connected with the loss of religious traditions, the ultimate meaninglessness of modern life, and the devaluation of ethical and moral guidelines. But many of these same people tell us that Islam is different. Islam can adopt the technology and the know-how, the progress, development, and expertise while preserving its own moral and spiritual strength and avoiding the social disintegration of the West. In other words, they think that Muslims can forget Tawheed, embark on a course of taqdeer, and suffer no negative consequences. Especially surprising here is the extent to which contemporary Muslims seem to think that an Islamic order can be imposed by modern states, with their historically unprecedented ability to indoctrinate and coerce. The actual attempts to do so demonstrate clearly that an Islamic quote-unquote society can easily be turned into another version of the monstrous totalitarianisms that have been all too characteristic of the modern world. The pervasiveness of bureaucracy, technology, and the worldview of taqdeer and their steady encroachment on all human relationships mean that more and more of the world is dehumanized, reified, and opened up to manipulation. Traditional moral constraints carry little weight in face of the institutions of modernity, especially at the time of crises. And when has there not been a crisis? The fact that so many people think that Islam can flourish and simultaneously adopt the gods of modernity shows that they have lost the vision of Tawheed that used to give life to Islamic thinking. They cannot see that everything is interrelated, and they fail to understand that the worship of false gods necessarily entails the dissolution of every sort of order, the corruption not only of individuals and society, but also of the natural world. In other words, when people refuse to serve God as reality itself demands that they serve Him, they cannot fulfill their human functions. When people refuse to live in harmony with the transcendent principles that determine the way things actually are, they bring about chaos and disorder in the natural and social environments. The Quran sums up the process in the verse, corruption has appeared in the land and the sea because of what the hands of the people have earned. Quran, Surah 30, verse 41. Corruption, fasad, is defined as the lack of wholesomeness, salah. And the wholesomeness is wholeness, health, balance, harmony, coherence, order, integration, and unity of the individual, social, and cosmic levels. It can be established only through Tawheed or making things one. The next section is called the Rejection of Tradition. Major obstacles prevent the recovery of the intellectual heritage. These can be discerned on the societal level in the diverse beliefs and attitudes that have been adopted by modern day Muslims as a result of their loss of intellectual independence and their blind imitation of the norms embodied in the ideals, institutions, and structures of the modern world. Among these obstacles are the politicization of the community, monolithic interpretations of Islamic teachings, and unthinking acquiescence to the ideological preaching of Muslim leaders. Perhaps the deepest and most pernicious of these obstacles, however, is the general trend to reject all but the most superficial trappings of the Islamic tradition. Like other religions, Islam is built on tradition, by which I mean the sum total of the transmitted and intellectual heritages. Nonetheless, many Muslims see no contradiction between believing in the gods of modernity and accepting the authority of the Quran and the Sunnah. In order to do this, they need to ignore 1300 years of Islamic intellectual history and pretend that no one needs the help of the great thinkers of the past to understand and interpret the Quran and the Sunnah. We need to keep in mind that the only universally accepted dogma in the modern world is the rejection of tradition. The great prophets of modernity, Descartes, Rousseau, Marx, and Freud, followed a variety of gods, but they all agreed that the old gods were no longer of any use. In the Islamic view, God's prophets shared Tawheed. The prophets of modernity shared Taqdeer. One can only reject God's unity by inventing other gods to replace him. In Islamic theology, God is Qadim, ancient or eternal. He has always been and always will be. In modernity, the gods are new. To stay new, they have to be changed or modified frequently. The new is always to be preferred over the old, which is outmoded and backward, quote unquote. Science is always making new discoveries and technology is constantly offering new inventions that quickly become necessities. Anything that is not in the process of renewal is thought to be dead. Our name for this God of newness is, quote unquote, originality. He rules by ordaining new styles and models, and his priests are found everywhere, especially in advertising and mass indoctrination. The fashion mujtahids tell women what to wear, but they change their fatwas every year. The world of art blatantly and openly worships originality as the highest god. Or take the modern university, where professors often adopt the latest theories as soon as they arrive from Paris. The greatest danger of the hostility toward tradition that is so common among modern day Muslims is that they have accepted the God of newness, like so many others, without giving any thought to what they're doing. As far as they're concerned, Muslim thinkers and intellectuals have had nothing to say for 1300 years. They would like to retain their Muslim identity, But they imagine that in order to do so, it is sufficient to keep their allegiances to the Quran and Sunnah and ignore its great interpreters. For such people, the ruling gods are progress, science, and development. They imagine that we know so much more about the world than those people of olden times because we, quote unquote, have science. Of course, they themselves do not have science. They simply heard and believed that scientific knowledge is real knowledge. They know little about the goals and methods of science and nothing about the Islamic intellectual tradition. They are blind imitators in intellectual issues. That is, on the level where they should be striving for their own understanding. What is worse, this is a selective imitation, since they only accept the authority of the scientists and the experts, not that of the great Muslim thinkers of the past. If Einstein said it, it must be true. But if Al-Ghazali or Mullah Sadra said it, then it can't be true because it isn't scientific. Finally, let me suggest that the most basic problem of modern Islam, a problem present in every religion, is that believers suffer from what has traditionally been called compound ignorance, jahal muraqqab. Ignorance is not to know. Ignorance is not to know? Compound ignorance is not to know that you do not know. Too many Muslims do not know what the Islamic tradition is. They do not know how to think Islamically, and they do not know what they do not know. The first step in curing ignorance is to recognize that you do not know. Once people recognize their own ignorance, they can go off in the search of knowledge, talib al-ilm, a search which, as the Prophet said, peace be upon him, is incumbent upon every Muslim. And indeed, one would think on every human being. No recovery of the intellectual tradition will be possible until individuals take steps for themselves. The tradition can never be recovered by imitation or by community action, only by individual dedication and personal realization. Governments and committees cannot begin to solve the problem. Understanding cannot be imposed or legislated. It can only grow up in the heart. So now we're starting chapter 2, which is called Intellectual Knowledge. If you remember nothing else about intellectual knowledge, we need to keep in mind that it is achieved by tahqiq, which is to know things by verifying and realizing the truth and reality for oneself. One cannot verify the truth and reality of things without knowing them firsthand in one's own soul, without any help from anyone other than God. If knowledge is based on the words of the authorities or the experts, it is not realized knowledge, but imitative knowledge. It makes no difference if the authorities happen to be traditional prophets like Moses, Jesus, or Muhammad, or modern day quote-unquote prophets like Darwin, Marx, and Einstein. Some would respond that Muslims do not need to know things for themselves because they can follow the consensus or the ijma. But this is only true in transmitted matters, not in intellectual matters. There is no such thing as ijma in the Islamic intellectual disciplines. Basic issues such as tawheed do not depend for their truth value on the agreement of the ulama, as if the truth of a mathematical formula could be established by a vote. Rather, the truth of the issues is self-evident to those who understand them. One of the sure signs of the loss of the intellectual knowledge is the strange phenomenon of Muslim thinkers apologizing for modern science by appealing to the consensus of the scientists. Even stranger is that they think they have an intellectual position. This shows that they have confused transmitted knowledge with intellectual knowledge. Modern science is indeed built on consensus, but this simply shows that it is fundamentally a transmitted science, not an intellectual science. Scientists do not verify and realize most of what they think they know. Rather, they accept it from their own authorities. The truth of transmitted learning depends not on its self-evidence, but on the authority of its prophets and the reliability of its transmitters. It cannot be verified by individuals. Rather, it must be accepted on faith, trust, and precisely because it is knowledge by imitation. For the Muslim intellectuals, properly so called, the only possible way to know truth was to know it for oneself. When we do not know for ourselves, we have entered into the arena of transmitted beliefs. Modern science and learning is built on a vast structure of beliefs and presuppositions. The truth of its foundation beliefs is far from self-evident, and it certainly cannot be proven by the scientific method, given that the reliability of the method depends precisely on these presuppositions. The beliefs are part and parcel of a worldview which is accepted on the basis of heresy and consensus. It can be argued that a modern scientist who makes a new discovery has quote unquote verified and quote unquote realized it for himself. The Muslim intellectual tradition would not have called this tahqiq, however, because it does not extend deeply enough into the depths of the soul and spirit to recognize the real nature of things. Great scientific breakthroughs are achieved rather by what might be called flashes of intuition, which pierce the limitations of consensual knowledge. On occasion, this may be analogous to what the Sufi tradition calls unveiling, kashf. But the Sufi teachers always warn of the dangers of unveiling if it is not understood in the light of the Quran and the Sunnah. This is a very important point because a lot of the people try to go towards these visions or mukashafa, which is not in line with the Sharia. And I think he's making a very important point here that if it's not understood in the light of the Quran and the Sunnah, it can definitely misguide you. I'll continue. However this may be, the flashes of insight necessary for scientific breakthroughs merely highlight the prophetic character of the great scientists. It says nothing about the gods from whom the revelations are received. Whatever may be the exact nature of great scientific breakthroughs, the fact remains that the vast majority of scientists play the role of clerics, and workaday mullahs. In the very best cases, they are scientific mujtahids who apply scientific laws to new situations. The one thing a modern scientist or scholar can never be is a muhakkik, a realizer, unless he steps outside the context of his own discipline and allies himself with the living intellectual tradition. In short, modern scientists, and with far greater reason the gullible public, accept scientific discoveries and facts on the basis of hearsay and consensus. They trust the promise that the discovery can be replicated by empirical research. They're usually unaware that modern theories are devices employed to interpret data for certain ends. They do not comprehend that the prestige of the theories derives not from their inherent truth, but from their usefulness for achieving certain specific ends and the degree in which they are accepted by the scientists. That is the degree in which the scientific ulama reach consensus on the theory. Verifiable knowledge. Having alluded to some of the most profound differences between intellectual understanding and scientific findings, let me say something about the content of intellectual learning. What sort of knowledge can properly be verified and realized? What were Muslim intellectuals trying to know by themselves and for themselves without following authority? Note first that the purpose of the intellectual quest was not to gather information or what we call facts. It was not to contribute to the progress of science, much less to build up a database. Rather, its purpose was to refine human understanding. In other words, seekers of knowledge were trying to train their minds and polish their hearts so that they could understand everything that can be properly understood by the human mind, everything about which it is possible to have certain, sure, and verified knowledge. Each seeker of knowledge was trying to realize his knowledge for himself. He wanted to know his subject firsthand with unmediated knowledge. If he took his knowledge from a teacher or a book instead of realizing its truth for himself, he was an imitator. Imitation can provide only transmitted knowledge. Generally speaking, 4 major areas were considered the proper domains of realization: metaphysics, cosmology, spiritual psychology, and ethics. Metaphysics is the study of the first and final reality that underlies all phenomena. The topic of discussion is God, though God is frequently called by impersonal names such as being with a capital B, or the necessary, or the real with a capital R. Cosmology is the domain of the appearance and disappearance of the universe. Where does the universe come from and where does it go? Naturally, it comes from the real and goes back to the real, but how exactly does it get here and how exactly does it return? The intellectual tradition maintained that it was possible to verify the actual route of coming and going. Spiritual psychology is the domain of the soul, the human self. What is a human being? Where do human beings come from and where do they go? Why are people so different from each other? How can people develop their potentialities and how can they become everything that they should and must become if they are to be fully human? Finally, ethics is the domain of practical wisdom and interpersonal relations. How does one train one's soul to obey the dictates of intelligence, follow the guidelines of God, and carry out one's activities in harmony with the real, the cosmos, and other human beings? What are the virtues that need to be achieved by a healthy and wholesome soul? How can these virtues become the soul's second nature? It should be noted that the center of attention in all four domains was the nafs, the self or the soul. The human self is the key issue because it alone can come to know God and the cosmos. The way it does this is by developing and refining its own inner power, which is called the intellect, aql, or heart, qalb. If people are to develop and refine this power, they need to know what sort of self they're dealing with. You cannot know yourself by asking the experts to tell you who you are. You do not reach knowledge of yourself from outside, only from inside. Until you know yourself from within, your self-knowledge will be based on imitation and not realization. All knowledge in the intellectual tradition was considered an aid in the process of coming to know oneself. The ancient maxim, know thyself, often in the version attributed to the Prophet, peace be upon him, or Imam Ali, he who knows himself knows his Lord, was taken seriously. The soul that is fully aware of itself is the soul that has perfected its potentiality as a knowing subject. In other words, through being fully conscious of its own reality, such a soul has become fully conscious of what God created it to be. The philosophers frequently called it aql bil fil, an actual intellect, or a fully actualized intellect. Such an intellect is nothing other than the soul that has perfected both its theoretical and its practical powers, both its vision and its virtue. Having become an actual intellect, the soul lives in harmony with God, the universe, and other human beings. When the greatest masters of the tradition wrote about these four topics, they were writing about what they had realized, not simply what they had heard from someone else or reasoned out on the basis of someone else's theories or discoveries. They were critical of those who tried to grasp the issues merely on the basis of transmission, imitation, consensus, or argumentation. Intellectual questions demand intellectual answers, and the place to pose the questions and to understand the answers is within the self itself. Among philosophers, Ibn Sina sets the tone of the quest when he describes the perfection of the soul in a passage found in two of his major philosophical statements, Al-Najat, the deliverance, and Ash-Shifa, the healing. The perfection specific to the rational soul is for her, the soul, to become an intellective world within which is represented the form of everything, the arrangement intelligible in everything, and the good that is effused upon everything, beginning from the origin of everything and proceeding on to the unconditioned spiritual substances. Then the spiritual substances connected in a certain way to bodies, then the high corporeal bodies along with their guises and potencies. Then she continues on like this until she fully achieves in herself the guise of all of existence. She turns into an intelligible world, parallel with all the existent world. She witnesses unconditioned comeliness, unconditioned good, and real unconditioned beauty while being united with it, imprinted with its likeness and guise, strung upon its thread and partaking of its substance. I will not try to unpack this package here. Let me just note that the four major domains of philosophical inquiry are all present, and that the focus is precisely on the soul that needs to be transformed into an actual intellect. Such a soul coming to know itself through spiritual psychology finds in itself metaphysical reality, the origin with a capital O, the whole cosmos in its various levels, and the realm of real and actualized ethics or virtue, the likeness of unconditioned good and beauty. Intellect. The key to the Islamic intellectual tradition is precisely the intellect, which is nothing but the soul that has come to know and realize its full potential. Inasmuch as the soul possesses this potential, it is often called fitra, or innate disposition. If we employ the language of the Quran, the fitra is the very self of Adam alayhi salam, to whom God taught all the names. Quran 2:31. It is the primordial Adam present in every human being. At root, it is good and wise because it inclines naturally towards Tawheed, which stands at the heart of all wisdom and forms the basis for the acquisition of true knowledge of God, the universe, and self. The problem that people face with their fitras is that they are typically immersed in ignorance and forgetfulness. As long as the soul stays ignorant and forgetful of God, it cannot know its own fitra and cannot properly be called an intellect. First, it must actualize its original innate disposition and come to know all the names taught to Adam. Only then can it be called an intellect in the proper sense. That is, a fully actualized intellect. To the extent that people fail to actualize their fitra, they remain ignorant of who they are and what the cosmos is. To the degree that they are able to actualize their fitra, they come to understand things in their principles or in their roots and realities. In other words, they grasp things as they are related to God or as they are known to God. They do not remain staring at phenomena and appearances. Rather, they see with God-given insight into the real names of things. These names subsist eternally in the divine intelligence, which is the spirit of God that God blew into Adam after having molded his body from clay. In short, the goal of the intellectual tradition was to help people come to know themselves so that they could achieve human perfection. To do so, one had to actualize both the theoretical intellect, which is the human self inasmuch as it knows all the realities and all the names, and the practical intellect, which is the human self inasmuch as it knows how to act correctly on the basis of the names taught by God. From the perspective of this tradition, if we know things outside the divine context, we do not in fact know them. To the extent that we think we know them, we will be afflicted by compound ignorance. The more confident we are about the truth of our knowledge, the more difficult it will be to cure the disease. Moreover, it should be obvious that the activity done on the basis of ignorance, not to mention compound ignorance, leads to ill consequences, not only for the individual, but also for society, the environment, and humanity. Basic findings. I repeat that.
We're going to stop here to page 30.
Oh, page 30? Okay, sounds good.